In their own lifetime, our mothers and fathers knew Jim Crow. His hand gripping tight around the neck of the American Negro. Squeezing out opportunity. Squeezing out hope. And people of color who must relinquish their seats on the bus. Who are barred from public amenities, deprived of the ability to earn a fair wage and feed their family. Ask, who will stand for me? Who will stand for me?
A lot of people in this country believe that the struggle for civil rights is a struggle that was over in the 1960s.
Racial discrimination is just as damaging as ever. It's less visible, it's more subtle.
Justice is not a place that you arrive at and stop. It's part of an ongoing struggle for equality.
We have to defend against those who would roll the clock back.
Defend, educate, empower. This is LDF's expanded mission as it confronts 21st century challenges.
Since I was 15 years old, I learned about these cases, and so here I am, 15 years later, and I'm going up to the Supreme Court with one of the cases that is, in my mind, maybe the last gasp that Brown has.
Brown, in which a small band of LDF lawyers argued before the Supreme Court and defeated segregation in public schools. Brown put LDF on the map.
For LDF, it is, our long-fought 52-year effort to ensure that black and brown and white children all get to go to school together.
African Americans are disproportionately represented in all stages of the criminal justice process. And though the poor are guaranteed legal representation under the law, it's the quality of that representation that's often wanting.
Even in very serious cases like capital cases, we see people who may have had lawyers who really didn't have any criminal experience. I have one client who was represented by a real estate lawyer at his trial, even though he was on trial for his life.
I work with the Criminal Justice Project at LDF, involving children that have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
One of our goals is to make sure that people are given good lawyers, that they are allowed the constitutionally adequate protections that they are entitled to.
Giving them a second chance, asking whether or not they're people that might be able to contribute to society.
As a result of our nation's so-called war on drugs, American prisons are filled to capacity with African Americans serving inordinate sentences. Kemba Smith represents the collateral damage of that war. LDF attorneys were successful in having her sentence commuted. However, the parole restrictions placed on her life were unduly onerous.
This was a person who was not involved in a drug conspiracy because she wanted money, but because she had fallen in love with the wrong person. So it was an extraordinary amount of supervision for a person who was never ever a threat or a danger to anybody. And almost immediately after the supervised release was terminated, she started law school.
Opportunity often comes in the form of a paycheck, but more essentially as the result of safe housing and decent schools.
Our clients hopefully will be able to move out of segregated, high-poverty neighborhoods in Baltimore and into neighborhoods where their families will have much greater opportunity to improve their lives.
For our clients, it's a direct impact on their pocketbook.
Think you're entitled to be paid the same thing he's paid?
Yes.
I think so too.
People tend to think that it's not a big deal anymore. It's not as much of an issue, but we have some clients who have some stories to tell.
There is still a vast gap that separates people of color from the rest of society, and we have to work to close it.
Despite the Voting Rights Act, opponents of the black vote have configured districts to dilute voting strength to keep black people from the polls.
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was born there, so I saw firsthand what it was to be disenfranchised, what it was to be without representation and to not have a voice.
Voting is power. The vote is power.
Mr. Gooden, who attempted to vote when he turned 18 in Alabama, but was denied access to the ballot box because he couldn't pass Alabama's strict literacy test, and he voted for 4 decades after the passage of the Voting Rights Act when he was deprived of his voting rights again.
That's why fighting so hard, you know, for to get my voting right restored. They can say, well, Daddy voted, I want to vote too.
As recently as the 2000 and 2004 elections, blacks and other minorities faced well-orchestrated campaigns of intimidation. A year later, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita strike, wreaking unparalleled destruction in a region with a long history of voter discrimination.
We knew that a lot of things could not be business as usual. People would not be able to return home to their houses. People couldn't return to their jobs and their schools. And so common sense would dictate that elections could also not be business as usual. We got a court order to allow them to be stationed inside of polling sites, and we observed every facet of this process.
We recently celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
You know, that ink puts in place the guarantees of the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years.
But in order to make that celebration meaningful, we had to go out and share the stories from a historical perspective, but also bring life to the contemporary challenges.
We have very large shoes to fill, and all we can do is take what we have from our history, move it forward, and continue to fight for the things that LDF stands for.
The mission of LDF and its band of passionate young civil rights attorneys remains committed to advancing opportunities for people of color through litigation, advocacy, and public education.
Now we have the promise of equality. We have to fulfill that promise. That's what the Legal Defense Fund is doing in the 21st century.